Hey everyone, and welcome to the Weekly Marketer Podcast. Every single week, we interview deep dive experts in one of the many fields of marketing to drop huge knowledge bombs from the best of the best and teach you how to take your marketing skills to the next level. This is episode 14, and I'm sitting with Fitzpatrick, who is an expert at personal branding. Her background is in consulting with Fortune 500 marketing departments, and she's been taking her skill set to the individual level. She's helped launch an Amazon best-selling book. She's successfully brought multiple personal brands to market, and she's managed to do it all while making the transition into being a full-time digital nomad. Caitlin, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jeremy. I'm excited to be on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, this is interesting, kind of personal branding. And I think fairly or unfairly, that term kind of has a little bit of connotations when it comes to it, right? And I think that a lot of people think of like this Instagram flash sort of thing. So can you tell us, a little bit before you tell us about yourself, what is personal branding? What does that actually functionally look like?
Yeah, so it's funny because before we got on the phone, I did some searches just to bring up some stats and facts about personal branding because it is such a buzz topic right now. But in fact, the concept of personal branding is not new at all. I found that the first kind of reference and introduction of personal branding was actually in a book from 1937, which was called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill.
Not Gary Vee.
No, exactly. So I think that the concept as we think of it today is really based on social media and the 24-hour news cycle, knowing that somebody who doesn't exist today in our minds tomorrow could be an entire brand based on, a tweet that blows up and gets tons of publicity. So I think ultimately your personal brand is your reputation, and that it's just a different way of saying your reputation. And the thing to just keep in mind about it is that, platforms are constantly changing, trends are changing, social media channels change in popularity. But ultimately, when you think about your personal brand, you want to think of, your legacy and what you stand for.
Right. No, that's actually really, really interesting. And I think a kind of more holistic way of kind of viewing it than I think a lot of people treat it. So that's actually really fascinating. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Kind of how did you get into marketing generally? And then, kind of how did you really specifically sort of get into like personal branding? What does that journey look like?
Yeah. So when I went to college, I studied Spanish and communications, and I've always been really interested in human behavior and also what that translates to in the form of art. So how people articulate concepts through both visual and verbal communication has always been something that I've been fascinated by. So that, to me, my career has evolved. I started working at a communications agency. I actually started on the research and analytics team, which I loved because basically we were studying human behavior and how people behave in terms of, what messages resonate with them, what campaigns might work with them. I also have worked on, new product launches. So not just understanding what products people might like, but also what things people definitely don't like so that companies are not bringing something to market that will fail.
That's actually almost worse, right? I've often joked, kind of being on the more performance sort of side of things that, you only hire me when you want something it's either going to do great or it's going to fail immediately. So, and doing that kind of market research, that due diligence is extremely important. So you've got this, kind of interesting background with kind of from an educational standpoint, and you've got this kind of really cool, experience in kind of like go to market and things like that. And, kind of how do those skills kind of translate more towards like a personal branding sort of career?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was working at a big agency and working for these huge brands, it's really exciting because you are, one day you're working on a project and then, a couple months down the road, you might see that product sold in a store or a commercial on TV. So the impact is really big. But, there are many people involved in decisions at that, level in a corporation. So I found it really rewarding when I got to work on projects that were maybe a little bit smaller, where you were working maybe one on one with somebody in the design department, for example, and you could provide counsel and have influence over something that they implemented right then and there. So I started, I learned from this big agency and it was awesome experience and I did a lot of cool projects and I decided that I wanted to take that experience and bring it down to the individual level because there are so many people that are doing really cool work or have these really awesome passion projects and they don't necessarily know how to get them off the ground. So that's really where I switched gears from, working on big projects with big corporations to the individual and figuring out how to apply those concepts to the individual.
No, that makes a ton of sense to me. So you're really kind of looking for impact, right? And that's why you kind of got into this individual sort of personal branding thing. And kind of what is that like functional transition been like when you're talking about working with a large team and you have a lot of resources? Obviously, there's some bureaucracy and things like that, but you kind of compare and contrast what like the actual day-to-day work is like in one versus the other.
Yeah. So, now that I'm on my own and running my own business, what I have to do is when I don't know how to do something, I either have to learn it or go find someone to partner with that knows how to do it. And so the major difference, I think, is that I've had to build my network around me and figure out what are the things that I can go out and learn and would that be more cost effective, than just hiring somebody on for a couple hours? And what I loved about the transition has been I'm getting to, rub elbows with all these people that are experts in their thing. And I'm learning so much because, for example, when we were launching the book on Amazon that you reference, we worked with you actually to help us figure out how to optimize our ads on Amazon. And that was something that I knew nothing about. And we went out and did some research and people said, call Jeremy. He knows everything about this. So it's been really cool to I feel like I'm really expanding my knowledge base and now I can help other clients and they benefit from these pieces of knowledge that I'm picking up from all these different projects.
Right. Well, yeah, no, it's definitely kind of a interesting sort of approach, right? And like kind of trying to figure out that on your own versus kind of having the big resource. And obviously, kind of there's advantages and disadvantages. But yeah, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and kind of talk about, so I think we've got a good idea of kind of who you are. And we kind of got like a high level of that. And so, we kind of talked about what is personal branding, but like, where do you see personal branding going? Where's the industry at today? And then kind of where do you see it heading in the future?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those topics that is obviously, like we were saying, a super popular topic right now. I did a LinkedIn learning search because I have been using a lot of those courses to learn about different things. And there's over 200 results of the phrase personal brand. A search for the hashtag personal brand on Instagram has over 182,000 posts.
That's a lot of personal brands.
Yeah, a lot of branding. So there's a lot of conversation about it right now, and there's millions of examples, as you can imagine, whether it's public figures or athletes or musicians or you name it. But the thing that I want to just point out is that there is no one way to do things. And I've read a lot of different, blog posts and articles and books about this topic. And ultimately, there's something that I think is really the art and science of a brand that you need to work with, the let's just say it is a personal brand. You need to work with experts that can help you define what your brand is. I think it's really hard because people, there's all these things advertised on Instagram where it says like 12 steps to define your personal brand. Like, plug this in and out the other end comes your brand. And it's not really like that. There's some trial and error. There's a lot of understanding of your competitive space that needs to happen. So I think ultimately there's a lot of tools available. There's a lot of proprietary toolkits and steps that companies sell, and there is no one way to do it.
Interesting. Okay, so let's say, let's take, for example, like just somebody wanted to start like kind of a personal brand. And you're saying that there's a lot of different ways. How would you kind of determine what that way is? You know what I'm saying? Like, I guess I'm trying to just understand, if there's all these different ways to build personal brands, and you probably need somebody that kind of has some experience in the field, right? Rather than trying to like do some canned course or whatever, because a personal brand is in fact personal, go figure. How would you kind of start that process? What does that look like, if you're going to build a brand for someone?
I think the main thing, I just was talking with a client about this today, is you have to start with your business goal in mind. So every business or individual will have different communication needs depending on what their goal is. So, for example, if your goal is to sell a bunch of books versus your goal is to get a bunch of speaking opportunities versus get hired for your next job, what you do might shift or be slightly different. So I think ultimately, while the business goal conversation is not always the most exciting, when people try to skip over that step, it's a problem. And I'll tell you kind of a story that maybe will kind of solidify this. I was once in a meeting where, we were talking about creating this brand, and the brand didn't have a name yet. It didn't have packaging. We hadn't talked about, the target audience. But, during that meeting, somebody leaned over to me and said, here's a stack of advertisements for competitive products. And then they basically said, you should take a look at this and come up with some ideas. And at that point, like I said, nothing had been established. So my question back was a list of 1,000 questions, which are, what are we trying to sell? Who are we trying to target? Why are we talking about advertisements today when we haven't come up with a plan? So while the business goal part of a lot of conversations is, might be more of an honest conversation related to like, how much budget do we have to put toward this and what do we want to make back from our investment? It's really important so that you're not creating this brand that's sloppy and disconnected and starting with, conversations about advertisements.
Interesting. So that's actually kind of counter to some of the advice that I've read, which is said, just make a brand now, establish yourself as an expert in whatever it is you do, and then worry about kind of exploiting it later. Like, don't have a goal explicitly at first because it won't come off as organic and real. And instead just do it and then figure out how you're going to like kind of monetize it or whatever, or what the business goal is after the fact. How would you kind of respond to that? Just out of curiosity. You're the expert, not me, but it's kind of interesting kind of hearing different sort of sets of advice in that regards.
Yeah, I don't think you need a full-fledged business plan, that you spend a year on before you do anything. I don't think that's the case. I think there's probably a middle ground. I think having the basic business discussions is important to do, but I wouldn't say wait to get started until every single I is dotted and T is crossed. One of the pieces of advice I heard a long time ago from another branding expert was, if you have a business name that you want to use or go to market with, go get every single channel with that name and sign up, get the Facebook page, get the Twitter handle, get the Instagram account, and just secure all those channels so that somebody else doesn't do it before you. And then, you have those channels, you can spend a little bit of time building out, your color palette and your logo and all of your look and feel of your brand. So I think that there's the jumping the gun, trying to go to market and post every day on Instagram without having a business plan in mind or business goals in mind, versus the waiting until everything's perfect. So I think there's like I said, a middle ground somewhere.
Okay. Interesting. So so you're basically saying you don't have to have everything perfect. You can definitely still be lean and move quickly, but you should have some sort of high level goal for what it is that you want to be doing, why you're doing this.
Exactly. And I think that, that kind of brings me to another point, which is I think your personal brand is iterative and it's always a work in progress because there will be new mediums, there will be new endeavors that you get into. If your personal brand and what you're creating is a side hustle, you're obviously not going to have tons of time to spend on it outside of your day job. Whereas maybe over time that mix will shift and you'll start working part time on your day job and doing more on your personal brand. So I think that it's okay and it's important to remind ourselves that we can't do everything full fledged day one, guns blazing. I think you need to be realistic about what resources you have, meaning like how much time, how much money. You might not have a ton of money to develop a website right away, but you might start with Instagram because you can do it for free and it can be your side project. And then a few months in, once you get some momentum, you might decide to hire a web designer or do a podcast or create videos. So it definitely can be an iterative process.
No, that is interesting. So, you kind of touched on some different things with the iterative process and kind of the social media aspects and things like that. Like, what do you see the future of personal branding being, from like kind of an industry standpoint, right? Where obviously a lot of people are trying to do kind of lifestyle brands and things like that on Instagram and stuff like that. Do you think that's what we're heading towards, more of that? Do you think it's going to shift at some point? What are your thoughts there?
I think what it will become is that there will be more brands around categories that maybe are not super saturated. So when you look on Instagram and maybe I don't know if I'm getting targeted with this and you're not, but there's tons of these personal branding classes and courses and seminars and there's like the Hillary Rushfords of the world and the Jenna Kutchers and it's take this 30-minute class and learn how to develop 100,000 Instagram followers in a year and make money while sitting on the beach. Like, I don't necessarily think that that's the future. I think that a lot of those people are doing those things very well. But I think there are going to be people who potentially have other interests and are building other types of businesses that will become personal brands that we haven't seen yet.
Interesting. And as an aside, I don't get those. I get a special different kind of thing, which is like, hey, bro, you want to make $1 million on Facebook ads while playing the stock market or something like that? Like, it's a very different, same vein of people, but a very different sort of messaging strategy.
Yeah, I believe it. Some of them are very well done and their brand stories are very strong and they have a great you look and you can tell that they curate their content and they have a color palette and they use the same fonts and all those things. And that's great. I think the ones that resonate with people most are the ones that are authentic and the ones that don't seem like the modern day infomercial.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess there's kind of an interesting follow-up question, as you're kind of saying that, what the future is, and we kind of defined it as not this kind of sit on the beach and become a millionaire overnight sort of thing. But what we did, and kind of, I guess it remains to be seen what the future will be. But, that's an interesting kind of point, which is how do you, if you're working on building a personal brand, especially on social, it can feel kind of like a little forced, I guess, to put content out there and be authentic about it. Right. And like look at it and say, okay, I'm going to put this out there in the world. I'm going to do, I'm going to take this jump, but everything feels so mechanical and forced. So how do you be authentic at scale, essentially?
Yeah, so I think ultimately it comes back to when you get started and you sit down and start to, there's tons of different exercises, like I mentioned, that all ladder up to personal brand. I think it's about really carving out what your uniqueness is, like what your unique value proposition is. So, I think people, when the market becomes saturated with all these, copycats and everybody's doing the same thing, and you can tell, oh, that influencer is trying to copy off that influencer. It's not effective. But if you have a story to tell and it's your story and you can map out all those elements at the beginning. And I'm not saying go spend, 100 grand creating your personal brand. I'm saying, do some simple exercises like, who are you? If you were a car, what type of car would you be? What would you look like? Those kind of things that may sound silly, but they help you articulate what makes you different. I'm sure if you Google personal branding exercises, millions of them will come up online, but really it's like find the 3 words that, articulate what you stand for. And everything that you post should ladder back to those 3 things. If you can do simple things like that and stop following what everybody else is doing, I think it'll work. And then of course there's tons of best practices with using hashtags and tagging other people and participating in conversations. But before you even get to that, I think it's figuring out what makes you unique and different in your, the sea of sameness.
Right. No, I like that, where it's kind of focus on the strategy first, and then, kind of the rest of it will come later on. So of those, kind of, you were joking around about kind of your words, not mine, kind of silly exercises when it comes to personal branding. What's your favorite silly exercise? What's your favorite one?
The one that I really liked that I did recently with a client, and it was in this branding workshop that I went to with one of my clients, and the group is called Brand Builders Group. They're based out of Nashville. And one of the exercises that we did was create a list of your yeses and a list of your nos that get you to your ultimate business goals. So what are the things that you're doing currently in your business life and related to your business life that are, helping you, and what are the ones that are no longer serving you? And it was just a really nice exercise, because sometimes it takes putting those things on paper and saying like, well, I go to this one event every week and I do this every quarter. And you start to realize that you're spending a lot of time on things that maybe are not serving you and your mission. So if you can then say, okay, I used to go to that event every week, but now I think it's enjoyable for me. So I'm going to scale back and maybe go once a month and spend the rest of that time, doing something else that actually gets me to my end goal. That was a really helpful exercise.
Okay. That's actually really interesting. I super like that. So if you were going to basically do that exercise, you would need to go back to kind of that overarching strategy, right? And I think one thing that I see a lot of people is they know they want to do something different, but how do you kind of, inspire that, what is the business goal? And, think about yourself as the business, like, what is my goal? I know I want to do something different. I think that a personal brand is the right way of getting there. How do you kind of find that and ignite that passion and figure out what it is that somebody specifically wants to do?
So I think a good way to get into that space is, and again, every, branding agency or strategist will have different ways of getting you there. But one of the exercises that I like is a blue sky thinking exercise, where you sit down, and this could be done, between 2 people. It could also just be done by reading a question and, free form thinking, or typing out your responses. But things like, where do I see myself 1 year from today? What are the things that a year from now, my clients are going to turn to me and say, you made my life better because. And so you start to really visualize some of the things that will change. And then it helps you really get into that mindset of where you want to go. And another helpful exercise that I've done before is if so obviously it takes defining where you want to go, but if okay, I want to be a professional speaker. One of my clients, her goal is to become a professional speaker and trainer. So what we did is we identified 10 to 15 aspirational competitors in her space, that cover similar topics or just broadly do what she wants to do. And we basically did this really in-depth competitive analysis of every single one of those people. So, what do their websites look like? What are their logos? What types of communication do they send out to their newsletter subscribers? How detailed is their website when it comes to case studies? And ultimately, we mapped out this whole plan based on things that we liked and then things that we thought, oh, that might be good for them, but we're going to do things differently. And it was such an awesome exercise because if those are the people that you want to be like, and those are the, your end goal aspirational competitors, then you really should be looking at those best in class elements. And I can't tell you, I've gone back to that analysis so many times just to say, oh yeah, we really liked that one speaker video, that speaker reel. Like, how long was it? What type of, lighting did they use? What, how many snippets did they have? And to put yourself in the shoes of where you want to be and who you want to be, whether it be through this, analysis or these types of blue sky thinking exercises, that's, I think, key to, getting over that hump and getting to the next step.
Right. No, I really like it. And sometimes I think it can be definitely easier, whether it's in personal branding or any kind of marketing, really, to kind of look at what a competitor is doing and say, I like that, I don't like that, and then start off almost with exclusion versus other things as kind of the place to start. So I really do like that actually quite a lot. So kind of, I guess what I would say next is you've given a lot of like really awesome kind of high level advice, right? If we're going to take it down to kind of the individual level, what do you see people doing wrong most? And what do you see people doing right most in your experience when it comes to personal branding?
I have seen a lot of people who will have one presence on one channel that's very different than their presence on another. So I've worked with clients, for example, when they hire me, they'll say, I created this website a couple of years ago. I have a blog that I don't really update. And then, I have some stuff on Instagram, but it's mostly like my family pictures. So I think a big part is creating, we talked about coming up with strategies and laddering back to business goals, but I think there's also the communications plan that people need to put together, kind of the strategy behind how they communicate about their brand. I think, there's this misconception that people have to be on social media 24/7 to be effective. And I actually think if you post less, but do it under that same strategy that feels all part of the same strategy and the same family of communication, that's actually better. And further, I think, whenever you're starting this whole process, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of people have like a Facebook page and a LinkedIn, but I think you need to go out and scour the internet and see what is out there about you first, and then make sure you're updating everything as you go. One of the clients I started working with last year, she's a doctor and she didn't have a social media presence at all. She said, I keep my stuff super separate. So I don't even have a LinkedIn page. So I think that, you want to be discoverable online, but you need to make sure everything is cohesive.
No, that's really interesting. I actually really, really like it. So the cohesiveness is definitely something to look out for. So I guess kind of if you were going to give like kind of an actionable takeaway to kind of our audience today, what would that be? What would you say, you want them to take away from this conversation and kind of start doing a little bit better?
I think first and foremost, it's pay attention to the conversations that are going on right now about personal brand.
Any specific ones?
Yeah. So if I think I mentioned at the outset that there's a lot of conversation online, both on Instagram and Twitter, et cetera. I actually think there's some really interesting articles there was an article in Forbes that came out January 25th about 12 mistakes that can destroy your personal brand. So there's a lot of lists and things like that. I think Forbes has had like 4 or 5 different articles in January alone about personal brands. So, reading up a little bit to see what some of the experts are saying on the topic is always helpful. I think that in terms of if we're talking about tips for how to, create your own personal brand, I think there are some simple things to start doing today. Like, for example, you could create a Pinterest board of different looks and feels when it comes to color palette and typography and things that you could start to compile so that you are creating a look and feel for yourself. And I think that paying attention to just trends in general about branding is important. There are so many different facets of this, and it can get really complex and confusing. For example, when it comes to, logo usage and your font usage and all those things. I mean, I don't think every single person needs to go through this super in-depth exercise, but I think if people just are made aware of the fact that, your personal brand matters and it's possible to start to manage it on your own using some free resources and just a little bit of thought, everybody's stuff will look better.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really, I like that a lot, actually. And that is some great actionable steps that you can do, is start thinking about kind of these earlier stage sort of pieces of it right now, and don't overcomplicate it. Would that be a fair kind of lesson to take away from what you're saying, is don't overcomplicate it and just get started, with these kind of small pieces?
Yeah. Don't let the conversation around the business goals and the strategy scare you away from doing anything. Those things are definitely something to keep in mind, but you can absolutely get started today and use free tools like Canva to create content that you can export to social media.
Absolutely. So, Caitlin, I super, super appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. I think that I definitely learned a lot, and I think that there's a lot of kind of great actionable takeaways and things like that, especially around, style and kind of building towards having a business goal and things like that. I guess final thing that I want to do is I always let my guest pitch anything that they want. I've had some interesting things. I've had people pitch charities. I've had people pitch their businesses, obviously, mostly people pitching their own businesses, but all sorts of different sort of things. So I'm just going to give you the floor for a minute or two to kind of pitch whatever it is that you would like.
Yeah. So actually, my pitch is a request that anybody who's listening contact me if they think that we might be able to partner on something. My Instagram handle is freelancefitz, Fitz, and I can definitely be contacted on there. And what I'm looking to do is basically find other people who are interested in project work and collaborating on different projects to, work on things together. So I am by no means an expert at everything under the sun. So I definitely rely on other experts to, find ways to work together and solve client challenges. I think one of the things I like most about this new freelance world and the gig economy is that you're not limited by the people who sit in your office or work at your company. You can create partnerships and work on projects with anybody. So I would just love to invite conversation about, branding and personal branding and any sort of collaboration ideas.
Absolutely. Well, I love that, Caitlin. And thank you so much again for your time today. Everybody out there listening, if you're trying to build a personal brand or you've been thinking about building a personal brand, take this advice. It's incredibly valuable. Lots of gold nuggets in here about the right thing to do when getting started with building a personal brand. So thank you all for listening, and happy marketing.